Hello, welcome back to part 2 of Feeding Performance. We'll quickly look at energy, how much is needed. Asking that question, we get a varied answer. And it will vary and will depend on a series of factors such as, what is the training duration and type? Obviously, if I go out and run at 70% of my VO2 max, and I do it for 30 minutes, or I do it for an hour, then the amount of energy used is going to be different because I'm running for twice the time in the second one. Also the type of training I'm doing. So the more high intensity training, then obviously I'm requiring more energy for that, therefore I'll be burning off more. So high intensity aerobic exercise is probably one of the most demanding, because generally speaking we're doing it for longer periods of time and it's pretty intense as well. I could be doing sprint training, which is obviously 100 metre sprint training, which is obviously very demanding, but I tend to have a very large rest ratio compared to a work ratio, which means over my hour session, even though I'm working very intensely for short periods of time, I'll have plenty of rest between each. Whereas an hour session of high intensity aerobic running is going to have no rest periods. It's not actually intense workload compared to the sprint training bit, but it's over a much longer period of time. What is the athlete's current weight? So the actual weight of the athlete will affect the amount of calories that's needed. Obviously, the heavier the athlete, then the more work's being done. Does the athlete need to gain muscle or lose body fat? So if you're trying to lose weight, gain weight, as I said earlier on, then you might have a negative or positive calorie balance. Is the athlete injured? And this is one thing that a lot of athletes forget to do when they get injured. They have formed habits, as we talked about earlier, so they've got certain eating habits. And quite often when we get an injury, we continue those eating habits, and sometimes we continue to eat too much. And it means we go into this positive calorie balance where we're eating more than we're actually burning off, because we're not able to do our normal training with the injury. So during the injury, we need to maybe watch what we eat to make sure we're eating properly to recover from that injury, but also how much we're eating. Is it a training or recovery day? So again, depending on the day, we might want to vary the amount we eat. So on a hard training day, we're going to be eating more than on a recovery day. Likewise, if we if we have a recovery phase in our training during the year, a mesocycle of recovery or a phase of recovery, where maybe for a couple of weeks or up to a month we cut down our training load, then remember we also need to think about our diet at that stage as well, unless we want to end up putting on some weight. Okay, so athletes' requirements. We've got the main 3 macronutrients here. I haven't mentioned alcohol. Michael's covered that in a previous session. So carbohydrates are proteins, are fats, and are total energy. I've said before, in terms of government recommendations, we're looking at about 50% of our calories coming from carbohydrates, about 15% of our calories coming from proteins, and about 35% of our total calories coming from fats. That's for a normal individual. For an athlete, then we would change those round slightly. So about 60% would come from carbs, about 15% from protein, and about 20% or so, 20-25% coming from fats. For carbohydrates, individual quantities, but an intake based on individual weight is probably best. So you're looking at about 6 to 10 kilograms per day minimum. Protein requirements will differ depending on the type of training being done on the training day compared to recovery days. Strength training, higher protein requirements, maybe even up to greater than 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. Endurance or aerobic training, focus on carbohydrates and reduce protein slightly, so about 1.2 to 1.7 grams per kilogram per day. For a normal individual, you're probably looking about 0.8 grams per kilogram per day up. A few people sometimes ask about the percentage thing and says, oh, I need a much greater percentage, but you actually don't. So for instance, if I have 2 people of 70 kilograms, and one of them is a non-athlete and one of them is an athlete, and the non-athlete is eating 2,000 calories a day, 15%, which is the government recommendation roughly, is going to be about 300 kilocalories of protein a day. So he's going to be taking about 300 kilocalories a day. If we then look to the athlete's maybe going to be eating, let's say, 4,000 calories a day. So the athlete's eating twice as much as the non-athlete. And they're going to be taking twice as much protein as well. Therefore, the athlete's still going to be taking 15%, but that 15% is actually going to be 600 kilocalories a day. So if we transferred that round, divided the two by about 4, we'll get the amount of grams per day, because we've got about 4 kilocalories in a gram of protein. Even that out then and look at the person's weight of 70 kilograms, and you're going to find that the normal person then is going to be eating probably between about 0.8 grams and 1 gram a day per kilogram per body weight a day, and the athlete is going to be well over 1.5 or up towards nearly the 2 grams per kilogram per day there. So just by eating the extra volume of food that the athlete needs means they're actually eating more protein a day, and more protein relative to their body weight. In terms of fats then, usually about 15 to 35%, we've already said, of your daily intake, about 50 to 90 grams per day in total. And we're trying to choose fats that are good sources: oily fish, nuts, lean cuts of meat, poly or monounsaturated spreads, and fats if we can. Total energy will depend on the individual, will depend on the day, in terms of is it a training day, is it a rest day, but maybe up to 4,000 or even higher. Some athletes during the last Olympics were being quoted as taking up to 12,000 kilocalories a day, which seems to be, a pretty much excessive amount. But if that's the amount that they need to keep their body weight stable, then that's the amount they would need to take. We quick look at each one of the macronutrients then. So carbohydrates, large amount of scientific evidence is available to show how important they are to sport. This goes back to the 1960s when people were doing muscle biopsy techniques to look at the levels of carbohydrate in the muscle before, during and after exercise. And there was a link as far back then really made to the importance of carbohydrate and athletic performance. Those studies also realised that we have a very limited store of carbohydrates, so we really need to look after that store and make sure that we optimise it. Sustaining a good level is often very difficult for athletes because they're continually training, especially athletes who train multiple times in a day. So we have to make sure between those multiple training sessions that we're getting carbohydrate back in, we're recovering properly, and then we're recovering on a daily basis. This is taken from IAAF's 2007 brochure or leaflet by them, Nutrition for Athletes. So targets for carbohydrate intake: immediate recovery within 0 to 4 hours after fuel depleting exercise, about 1 gram per kilogram of body weight per hour consumed at frequent intervals. Daily recovery from a moderate duration intensity training session, then about 5 to 7 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And recovery from moderate to heavy endurance training or fueling up for a distance event, then we're looking at about 7 to 10 grams per kilogram per body weight per day, so something like carbo loading coming up to a big event. Some carbohydrate sources then. So on the left hand side we're looking at complex carbohydrates, and the right hand side we're looking at more simple carbohydrates. So complex are starches, rice, pasta, bread, potatoes, cereal, things like that. They're slow to release to the bloodstream. Simple type carbohydrates, we're looking at sugars, honey, glucose, fruits, cane sugar. Very fast release into the bloodstream, so we tend to get big spikes. And there was a picture to show you here. We've got a tray bake type thing on a bit of cake. The problem with a lot of these fast release ones, they're quite often also contained in foods that are also maybe high in things like fats as well, so quite very, very calorie dense. Complex carbohydrates give you a nice slow release of sugar into the blood, whereas simple carbohydrates tend to give you a spike into the blood, which sometimes may be what you need, But under normal circumstances, what happens is then blood sugar levels go up very quickly. The body tries to adapt to that, very quickly takes on carbohydrate into the muscle and the liver. And what you can find then very quickly, especially if you're doing something, you can find a sugar drop as well, which means you start to feel hungry and stuff again because your blood sugar levels are low and your brain starts to sort of get worried because it feeds off your blood sugar. Protein, despite the research available on carbohydrates and the importance of carbohydrates, many athletes still believe that protein is the most important nutrient to achieve athletic success. The whole idea of the steak before the event, loading up with protein a couple of days before a big event, is still sort of considered by a lot of athletes as being the thing to do. But carbohydrate has been seen as the most important thing for most athletic events and competition and recovery from exercise. So yes, protein is important for recovery and we need it. A lot of recovery drinks will now have a ratio of 4:1 in terms of carbohydrate to protein. You get the carbohydrate into you to recover, to replenish the carbohydrate you've used, and protein to help that rebuilding process. Interesting enough, milk is about a 4:1 ratio, so it's seen as a pretty good potential recovery drink. Athletes do have increased requirements compared to the general population, but these are usually met because athletes are eating more. So 15% of 4,000 calories is more for that person's body weight than 15% of 2,000 kilocalories for the general population. Most athletes will have no difficulty in consuming enough protein, but some athletes will need to monitor their intake. Particularly if you've got an adjusted diet, or perhaps maybe if you're a vegetarian and perhaps maybe don't feel you get enough protein maybe in your diet, then maybe you should be looking at things like that. So anybody with an adapted diet maybe needs to make sure that they're getting enough of protein in their diet. Some protein sources there. We've got some dairy products, obviously things like milk, great source of protein. We've got cheeses, we've got yogurts. But remember, these can also be connected to fat and saturated fat. So just be careful about these. So, low-fat substitutes, make sure you're drinking semi-skimmed milk rather than full-skimmed. Low-fat yogurts rather than full-fat. Lower-fat cheeses. With the meat products here, again, we can see a difference in what we would say is quality. We've got some fish stuff at the front here. We've got a bit of fish, better quality fats for us. Right up there to some sort of cooked meats, which can be very processed, can be very high, not just in protein, but also in fat, and things like salt as well. So we try to avoid the more processed foods if we can, and stick with the healthier alternatives like the fish products or nice lean meat. Even for things like grains, try to and select stuff that are slightly less processed. The more processing goes on, usually the more things are added, like salt and extra sugars, and the more the grains and stuff are broken down and become more simple rather than complex. Protein sources, if we're looking for protein-rich foods, 10 grams of protein is provided by any of the following. Again, this comes from IAAF's 2005 Nutrition for Athletics. Just a few examples. 2 small eggs. Again, be careful of the amount of eggs eaten in a week. 200 grams of yogurt, 90 grams breakfast cereal, 60 grams of nuts or seeds, 200 grams of baked beans. Be careful of the amount of sugar in some baked beans. Fruit smoothies, there are 150 ml of fruit smoothie. Again, can be high sugar content. You need to watch sort of the calories then you're taking in terms of sugar and also teeth. Okay, lastly then, fats. Government recommends that these make up no more than about 35% of your total energy intake. This should be lower for an athlete, so we're probably looking more between 20 and 25% for the athlete. Can be saturated or unsaturated fats, and as you probably know, saturated fats are seen as being better for you than saturated fats are being seen as worse for you than unsaturated fats. So what we're trying to do is probably have the bulk of our fats as unsaturated. So saturated fats linked to heart disease and other health issues. They should contribute no more than about a third of your fat calories. So about 35% or so, then only about just over 10% should be saturated. Just over 10% then should be monounsaturated, and just over 10% should be polyunsaturated, which means only a third of your fats are going to be saturated fats, which are linked to cholesterol, high cholesterol, heart disease, etc. Remember though, fat is still needed for a healthy, balanced diet. So people get so hyped up on fat, they try to cut it out completely out of their diet. But fat is a required part of a healthy, balanced diet, so make sure you don't cut it out completely. Okay, that's the end of part 2. I'll see you in part 3.